Welcome to another episode of the brand called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome an accomplished author from New Delhi, lives in Greece, but talking to us from New Delhi, Radhika Jha. Radhika, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thank you. Radhika is an author and a dancer. She's an author of 5 books. Her latest book is The Hidden Forest, and she has other books are Smell, The Elephant and the Maruti Stories, Elephant and the Maruti Stories, Lanterns on Their Homes, and My Beautiful Shadow. So, Radhika, my first question, your life has been very international. Growing up in Mumbai, living in Japan, Beijing, and now Athens. How have these global experiences shaped your worldview and writing?
Well, I think I feel very lucky that I've lived in all these places, but it's a tough thing as well because you always leave a part of you behind.
Mm.
And in every single place you go, you actually end up inventing yourself
Correct.
again.
Correct.
So it's interesting because you discover new bits of yourself,
Mm.
but then also some bits which you might have wanted to hold on to,
Mm.
you end up having to give up on.
Mm.
So it's a bittersweet experience.
Mm.
Um, I can't say that I've enjoyed all of it, but I feel deeply enriched by the
Mm.
experience. But
Mm.
what I did find is that I think in the end, my first place, sort of after I got married, when I really moved as an adult, was Japan.
Mm.
And as a writer, where my
Yeah.
sensibilities had already formed.
Mm.
And when I moved to Japan, I was not sure that I would be able to write because I always had was under the impression that you write about the place you're from,
Mm.
and that is what nourishes you.
Mm.
And so I was not sure I'd be able to write anything. But then what I started seeing as you live in a place is that you actually grow roots in that place
Correct.
too, if you
Correct.
allow yourself to.
Yeah.
And also then you start understanding that the problems we all face
Mm.
are similar,
Mm.
and the problems of being alive as being
Mm.
human are universal. It's that we tackle them in different ways, as different
Mm.
in terms of society, in terms of a community,
Yeah.
and as individuals, of course.
Absolutely. Well said. When I was reading about you and preparing for this conversation, I was fascinated that you studied anthropology at Amherst and political science at the University of Chicago. How has your academic background influenced your storytelling?
I think even before, I never planned to become a writer. I mean, it kind of happened a little bit as an accident
Mm.
because I had appendicitis, and it was an emergency operation because it had started perforating. And so then after that, I was at home with lots of drugs going through my body, very, very weak. And that's kind of when I began to write. I said,
Mm.
okay, let me just go back to writing. I'd written as a schoolgirl and had not touched fiction. And then I thought, okay, let's just take an idea and see where it goes. But before that, I always wanted to be a social activist. I was fascinated by how societies change.
Mm.
That was always the thing that interested me most.
Mm.
And I was never sure. I was always torn between wanting to be an academic and wanting to be an activist, wanting to actually make change happen. And then in the
Mm.
end, I thought that's what I would be doing, making change happen. And but what I love about anthropology, and I'm so happy because I switched from studying economics and political science in college to anthropology, because it was so human centered. It really puts human beings at the center. And at the same time, what it does is its vision of the human being is very different from psychology, for example, where in a sense, a human is a sort of a black box.
Yeah.
Whereas in anthropology, a human is actually a person is a network of relationships.
Mm.
And to me, that made so much sense
Correct.
that we are, in fact, our relationships,
Mm.
and that what we think is influenced indeed by everything around us, by our culture, by our attitude towards our parents. So I think that anthropology brings the past into the present and makes the past come alive.
Mm.
And that's why I chose to study anthropology. And then when I moved to political science, it was actually a continuation of anthropology, of social anthropology, really.
Amazing. You also mentioned that your stories often begin with a philosophical question that intrigues you. Give me an example of one such question that led to a novel.
Well, I mean, when I say philosophical question, I don't mean philosophy in, some grand
Correct.
sense.
Hmm.
But for me, philosophy is just simply the wisdom of living.
Hmm.
How do you live in a wise way, in a way that is using all one's capacities for being alive, in a
Hmm.
sense?
Hmm.
And so it's that kind of philosophical question that I'm
Okay.
looking at.
Hmm.
So, for example, in the hidden forest,
Hmm.
the question I was asking was simply when you move from one place to another place and you live a long time in another place and you grow roots in the other place,
Hmm.
what happens to the roots that you had in the first place? Do
Hmm.
they disappear? Do they simply shrivel up and die? Or does do they actually continue to survive? And
Hmm.
I think in my mind, since I have lived this nomadic life, I was trying to also understand because I didn't feel myself rootless actually. So I
Hmm.
was wondering, but where is my root? Why do I not feel rootless? What is this root of mine?
Hmm.
And what is the, what keeps what is the nature of rootedness and the relationship of roots to human beings who actually anyway have always migrated.
Right.
People always
Right.
migrate.
Right.
So
Right.
that was the question, the
Hmm.
philosophical question. In
Nice.
smell, it
Yeah.
was again actually related to migration,
Hmm.
but in a slightly different way because I was fascinated by the idea of how smells are something that you cannot put a frontier on
Hmm.
under any circumstances because you can't stop a smell from moving from one place to the other. But
Hmm.
at the same time, foreigners and outsiders have always been seen as people who smell different.
Hmm.
So, in a sense, it is a frontier in itself,
Correct.
a boundary.
Hmm.
So, these are the kind of things. So,
Very
there's a kind of
interesting.
a philosophical and paradoxical thing that I like to look
Very
at.
interesting. But since you've spoken about smell, let me ask you a question on smell, which is Smell was your debut novel, which won the French Prix Gerlian Award and was widely published all across the world. What inspired the story, and how do you see it relevant today?
Well, the story was inspired, I think, by my first experience of living in Europe. I was a student, I was in the US, but then I
Mm.
did a sort of a program, what do they call it, an exchange program, and I ended up in Paris. And at that time, I noticed that there was this really, it was very difficult to become legal as a foreigner. All the non-Europeans that I was seeing were the Indians, the Africans. They were all often were illegal immigrants,
Mm.
and there was this struggle to get legalized and to get your papers. And it was really, really, really difficult. The barriers were up even then. And this I'm talking about the 1990, that time. And so they were all there. They were working in restaurants. They all had jobs. They were making money.
Yeah.
They were without papers.
Mm.
They were not legal. So I think that kind of was, I noticed this, I sensed this barrier there right away. And then, of course, I was fascinated by the whole idea. I remember I was cooking one time in France, and that was the first time I cooked Indian food actually outside India.
Mhm.
And I remember the next morning, the whole apartment, because these are closed
Yeah.
apartments, and it was winter, the whole
Mm.
place was smelling of, but not of the spices the way I understood spice,
Mm.
the wonderful scents that make you feel so
Yeah.
alive in India,
Yeah.
but there was something almost dead about that smell.
Mm.
It was a totally different smell. It was something familiar and yet totally unfamiliar. And I think these are the experiences, I don't know where these things happen. There's a kind of alchemy, and these
Mm.
all just kind of came together in the book.
Yeah, interesting. You also say that, or you describe smell as a metaphor for migration, particularly in the way smells define and differentiate cultures. And I remember when we moved to Singapore, We were looking for some apartments, and I'm talking of the early 90s. People wouldn't give us a house because they say we don't like the smell of the food. But I'd love to understand from you how you believe smell is a metaphor for migration.
Because of, as I said, it's because you cannot stop a smell from moving.
Right.
It goes in the breeze. You
Mm.
cannot put a door or
Correct.
a window, or there is no way you can block out a smell.
Hmm.
So and I think human beings, we were born nomadic. I mean, if you look, since I studied anthropology, if you look at
Yeah.
the way where
Hmm.
humanity began,
Hmm.
we began with these two legs and we moved and we
Hmm.
ran and we hid. And and migration is sort of it's like it's an essential part of us. And I
Correct.
remember also my grandfather,
Hmm.
because in India we have this whole tradition of pilgrimage.
Yeah.
In the last part of your life after 60, you should at least have done one
Hmm.
pilgrimage to one
Hmm.
of the
Yeah.
dhams, right?
Yeah.
And my grandfather used to talk to me a lot about this idea, and he was like, now I'm going to go to Vaishno Devi, now I'm going
Hmm.
to do this. And we used to, and I always remember that. And he said, because we are meant to walk, human beings are
Hmm.
meant to walk. And
Hmm.
I went to the Kumbh Mela 25 years ago
Hmm.
and met the people and interviewed people. And I remember being fascinated to think there were some people who had come walked from Assam. So basically, that's why I felt somehow that this idea of walking, of moving, is an essential thing, and you cannot stop it, no matter how many boundaries you put.
Amazing. You also, Radhika, speak about modernity and tradition. How do you think your storytelling bridges the gap between the past and the future?
That's a tough one.
Okay.
But I mean, I think the truth is that past, sadly, is something that we lose almost instantly.
Absolutely.
You can say that the present and the future are still connected because your actions in the present
Hmm.
end up creating your future, right?
Correct. Correct.
But the past is what influences your actions in the present,
Hmm.
and yet we don't remember it.
Hmm.
When it's gone, it's gone.
Hmm.
So it's a kind of almost like an archaeological process.
Hmm.
And I think and storytelling
Hmm.
is it's just like that's I think why we tell each other's us stories, because
Hmm.
we're trying to figure out what it is that makes us do what we do in this moment.
Hmm.
So I would not say I can't say that storytelling is a way of getting the past back,
Hmm.
because I think in that sense it's poetry, which is the only thing that really allows you to
Hmm.
experience that moment which has already gone. There's
Hmm.
something, it's like alchemy, it's
Hmm.
magical.
Hmm.
Stories, on the other hand, are the things that kind of help you to understand the role of the past in the
Hmm.
present,
Hmm.
if that makes any
Yeah,
sense.
yeah, makes a lot of sense. The other aspect that I wanted to get your perspective on is that you describe your writing process as intuitive. Walk me through how a novel comes to life for you from the first idea to the time you publish it.
Well, writing is it's a real pain.
I agree. Yes.
It involves being alone.
Yeah.
It involves being stuck with your own inadequacies a lot.
Mhm.
Uh, Therefore, I would say that there is, if you're going to write, you have to be a bit crazy. And for me, I call it an intuitive thing, because it's you're using another part of your brain. I don't know whether it's intuitive.
Mm.
Maybe it's not intuitive, but I would say the part of your brain that you're using is the part of the brain that you don't access through rationality. And the parts of your brain, I would say, the imagination uses. So I'm interested in accessing the imagination, and I
Mm.
try to work through that.
Mm.
So it's like something from life tickles something, some event happens, or some experience, some person I meet
Mm.
tickles something in there
Yeah.
in the imagination.
Mm.
And I know that I can see that that has roots into something else,
Mm.
so which I have not really quite understood, but which I'd like to know more about.
Mm.
And so I want to follow that.
Mm.
And then there's a so that it's a kind of a journey, and it's a journey that you make with on an unknown road. So I think that's why it's intuitive. And then there's a sense of rightness. I can't quite
Correct.
explain it. When you're writing, I will keep rewriting and rewriting until
Mm.
I get that sense of rightness.
Correct.
And there is no way I can rationally explain to you how and why these things happen.
Absolutely. Well said. The my follow-up question is that, you also talk about Lanterns on Their Horns as your favorite book. And I've often been asked the same question, which is your favorite book? And I could never identify, but I would always say, this is the book that I worked the hardest on.
Mhm.
Why does Lantern on Their Horns have a special place for you?
It has a special place for me because I think it's sort of, in a sense, my homage to India, in a
Okay.
sense,
Hmm.
and also to, because I'm Jha, right? So I'm from Bihar,
Hmm.
and my family, even though I grew up in Bombay and Delhi,
Hmm.
the sort of family, the many tentacles of the extended family, they all would
Yeah.
show up in Delhi, and I would see
Hmm.
them. And I was always fascinated because, having grown up as a total Sheherwali and a
Hmm.
real sort of urban Indian, and going to English speaking schools and all that, and I'd suddenly come home, and there is somebody dressed in their dhoti and everything, with the tika, and everybody speaking Maithili. So
Hmm.
there
Hmm.
was this complete, break. And then when I went to school, that world
Hmm.
of the village, which
Hmm.
I still be able to touch at home, was laughed at
Hmm.
and was considered to be backward. And there, and I was always not convinced it was backward, because there was so much kindness. And when my father used to take me to the village,
Hmm.
in this, we used to go there always in the monsoon, and it was just gorgeous, and eat
Hmm.
mangoes and
Hmm.
things. And so I was, but at the same time, I knew that I was not from that world. But I wanted to know what that world was about.
Right.
I could sense that that world was changing, and it was a world that was fragile and under pressure.
Hmm.
And so that's why. And then finally, what kind of really set that book off was, I was at my cousin's wedding,
Hmm.
and she was getting married, and the father-in-law, his
Hmm.
bride's father, was a pandit, a real proper pandit, who used to do the puja and everything.
Hmm.
So we were standing, and suddenly I was there in front of him, and there was, in his dhoti, wonderful man. And I
Hmm.
was really thinking, wow, now what do I say to this person? We live in such different worlds. And I was back from college, and I was just thinking to myself, how strange the world is, and yet here we are together,
Yeah.
in standing in front of each other. And suddenly I asked him, I said, tell me something. Why do we Hindus think of the cow as being sacred?
Hmm.
And he smiled, and then he started talking. And he says, it's got nothing to do with the actual cow.
Hmm. Hmm.
I said, oh, really? He
Hmm.
says, no, it's got nothing to do with that. He said, it's because the very first ray of light from the sun, which is invisible, which is
Hmm.
the most nourishing, and the one that is really the bringer of life,
Hmm.
that wakes up life, the sap in the plant,
Hmm.
that ray, that light is called Gau,
Hmm.
and its nature is to move.
Right.
And so it was just fascinating. And he gave me this entire speech in most beautiful Hindi.
Hmm.
And so I listened to that, and I thought to myself, I don't know how to explain it. I think it was the sense of authenticity of that moment
Hmm.
that I wanted to, that set me off on that. And then I went to Madhya Pradesh, and I lived in the village. It was very difficult because I realized I was very different. And that was, I think, my first move my first move into the kind of writing I wanted to do, which is a writing where which of empathy, where
Hmm.
you put yourself into the skin of someone else.
Hmm. Amazing. I have time for one more question about your books, and then I've got a couple of questions on your dance. You spent 6 years in Japan, and you've written two books which are set in Japan. What fascinated you about Japan's transformation under global capitalism?
Um, I'm always, I think that is been my big question in life, because this global capitalism, it really is something that it's I've said this before, but to me, it really feels like a virus which comes into your system and turns everything upside down. And then, but eventually, somehow, like a pandemic, it finally becomes a part of your society.
Mm,
But the host body is also completely changed.
mm,
And in Japan, what I was fascinated by is that Japan was a society which is based on honor,
mhm,
right? And honor was, in a sense, the most important guiding principle in that
mm,
society. And then to suddenly have um, global capitalism, which is saying, competition, individualism, profit, how did Japan kind of deal with this? And I found their way of dealing with it absolutely fascinating because it was very human. I
mm,
saw a human form of capitalism, one in which people still cared for each other, where the human
mm,
where in the company might be going down,
mm,
and the you'll have the head of the company taking loan after loan after loan, but not for himself. It
mm.
would be because he was trying to pay the salaries of his staff. He didn't
Correct.
want to let them go. And
Mm,
where you have a minister when he's caught in being corrupt, when he's caught out,
mm.
he jumps out of a building and commits suicide. That is the
Yeah.
standard practice.
Mm. Wow. But I think I have time for one more question, and I want to talk to you about your dance. You perform and teach a rare form of Odissi that you learned from your guru Surendranath Jha ji. Um,
Jena.
I beg your pardon?
Surendranath Jena.
Jena. My apologies. My apologies. So, dance is often seen as a storytelling medium,
Mm,
just like writing.
mm.
How do your experiences and as a dancer and writer complement each other?
Ay, ay, ay. For me, to be honest, dance is my sadhana. Okay, it is my route. It is my invisible route.
Mm,
Um, it is what connects me to India, no matter where I go,
mm,
and connects me to my soul wherever I am. But if you look at dance as in terms of, yes, I mean, dance is telling a story,
mm,
but it's telling a story in space with music,
mm.
with the help of music
Yeah.
and rhythm.
Mm,
And it is so it's similar because in a sense you have nothing, you create a world in space, you create a story. With in writing you do it with words, and in dance you do it with gesture.
mm,
So they are similar in that sense,
mm.
but I think writing in a way is actually more abstract. In
Yeah.
dance you have more it's more concrete in a way.
Mm, Amazing.
But yeah, I think they are similar. You are still telling a story, but I think I haven't really, I think of myself as still a learner in both
Mm,
areas.
okay.
I'm still learning to tell the story.
Fascinating. And on that note, Radhika, I just want to say thank you so much for speaking to me about your own incredible journey. I think we covered some very interesting ground on writing, given your background in anthropology and political science. And you said you wanted to be an activist, but you ended up writing books and focusing on dance. Thank you for talking to me about your journey, about some of your books, and of course, your dance form. Thank you again, and good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the brand called You.